Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm Lavinia Boxall, Vice Chancellor for Advancement for Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and it's an honor and pleasure to join you here as part of our Rutgers Homecoming celebration. Whether you are enjoying this event from the Rutgers Student Center or virtually from your own home, it's wonderful to have our Rutgers community back together. I'm very excited that in addition to our traditional homecoming activities this year, we have included events such as this that showcase faculty research and shine a spotlight on our university's history. The Scarlet and Black Project was launched in 2016 as part of the Rutgers 250th anniversary celebration to seek out the untold story of disadvantaged populations at Rutgers and acknowledge their influence. The initial goal of the project was to create a 3-volume publication that would begin to provide a fuller record of Rutgers University by adding to its chronicles the experiences of African Americans and Native Americans, peoples whose impact is often lost in the pages of history. Today, we will hear from 2 incredibly distinguished professors, Dr. Deborah Gray White, who has co-directed the project since its inception and served as a co-editor of its publications. She will provide background on the Scarlet and White project and discuss how the focus and scope of its work have evolved. Dr. White is a Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University, who specializes in African American and American women's history, with a focus on issues of identity and the intersection of race, class, gender, and sexuality. She's been widely recognized for her scholarship and holds the Carter G. Woodson Medallion and the Frederick Douglass Medal for Excellence in African American History. Dr. White is continuing her work on the Scarlet and Black Project in her capacity as a distinguished faculty fellow at the newly established Rutgers Institute for Global Racial Justice. I'm also delighted that Dr. White will be joined in conversation by Dr. Michelle Stevens. Dr. Stevens, a psychoanalyst, was tapped by President Holloway to lead the new Rutgers Institute for Global Racial Justice, where she is the founding executive director. Dr. Stevens graduated from Yale University with a PhD in American Studies and is the author of Black Empire, the Masculine Global Imaginary of Caribbean Intellectuals in the United States, 1914 to 1962, and Skin X, Race, Psychoanalysis, and the Black Male Performer. Dr. Stevens has also published numerous journal articles on the intersection of race and psychoanalysis. Michelle Stevens joined the Rutgers Department of English and the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies in 2011 and served as the Dean of the Humanities in the School of Arts and Sciences from 2017 to 2020. It is my honor to introduce you to Dr. Deborah Gray White and Dr. Michelle Stevens, 2 really esteemed and incredible faculty members here at Rutgers University. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavinia. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm sorry that this is not happening in person. I think we would all like it to be, but given the circumstances, I think it's good that we're doing this. So I'm going to just start this off by just giving a tiny bit of background and say a little bit about the Scarlet and Black Project. So in 2016, when President Obama delivered the Rutgers commencement address, he described Rutgers as an intellectual melting pot where ideas and cultures flow together among what might just be America's most diverse student body. Clearly, much had changed since the school was founded in 1766, when only the male children of slaveholders walked the lawns of land that was once possessed by the indigenous Lenni Lenape. Though Native American students expressed interest in attending Rutgers, they were turned away when they and Blacks were turned away and were not just not allowed to enroll here. Although Blacks labored unrecompensed to build the campus, the first Black students did not arrive until the 1870s, and the first African American to graduate, James Dixon Carr, did not do so until 1892, fully 126 years after Rutgers was founded. By World War II, only 25 students known to be Black had graduated from Rutgers. The history of Rutgers' transformation from a lily white institution to what Obama, and by the way, US News and World Reports calls one of the most diverse schools in the nation. That history is recounted in the 3 volumes produced by the Scarlet and Black Project. We've traced Rutgers' history, primarily with African Americans, through more than 250 years. And I'm particularly pleased to highlight the 3rd and final volume, which features many of the alumni who are perhaps joining us today. Whereas the 1st volume showed us how Rutgers founders grew rich from the profits of slavery, how they justified Black debasement, and how New Brunswick African Americans resisted white control. And volume 2 showed us how the first Black students navigated the exclusively white campus population and culture. Volume 3, the last of the volumes, Scarlet and Black, Making Black Lives Matter at Rutgers 1945 to 2020, now demonstrates how African American students at Rutgers defied the status quo and made the university racially and culturally diverse. It shows how Black students on the Newark, New Brunswick, and Camden campuses applied pressure that not only changed admissions policies, but also the campus culture and curriculum. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Black and Puerto Rican students insisted that they mattered, and they changed Rutgers. This project began in 2015 after the then New Brunswick Chancellor Richard Edwards met with minority students who felt that improving the current racial and cultural climate at Rutgers was impossible without first answering questions about the university's history. Inasmuch as Rutgers was approaching its 250th anniversary, Chancellor Edwards agreed that the time was right for Rutgers, like so many other universities around the country, to reckon with its unsettling history. In 2015 and 2016, young people across the nation demonstrated against the presence of Confederate flags and memorials, the killing of unarmed Blacks by police and civilian whites, and the perceived rollback of the Academy's commitment to diversity and inclusion. Today, young people, indeed citizens of all ages, are still walking not just campuses, but city streets and rural drives to the chant, Black Lives Matter. Like the Rutgers students who in 2015 wanted a true depiction of African Americans in Rutgers history, many Americans are still demanding a history of America that includes African Americans and other oppressed minorities. Of course, there are also many who are trying to squelch this history, but far more, it seems, want to know what role universities play in making freedom a reality for all of American citizens and for people across the world. They want to know what the university's responsibility is in imparting knowledge that is inclusive of everyone's experience, and what part the university plays in preparing society to be inclusive and nurturing. Those involved in the Scarlet and Black Project have always maintained that our research is not meant to be an end in itself, but meant to answer some of these questions. We feel that our research and writing has helped Rutgers move ahead of the curve in establishing a university that nurtures inclusiveness and practices fairness. And we hope that Rutgers University uses the knowledge generated by our research and all of the discussions that it gives rise to do what needs to be done to make this institution one that reconciles its past with present recuperative programs for African Americans and other minorities. And with that, I'll stop and entertain any kind of questions, or at least entertain questions from you, Michelle.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Deborah. Yeah, I'm so glad at the end you kind of focused in a bit on the role of the university at the end of your opening comments, the role of the university and the role of researchers. Even the Institute is actually the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, intending to kind of flag a little bit our special role and responsibility as scholars. So I thought I would ask you to start by just, if you don't mind, talking a little bit personally about how you started off with the project. What brought you into it? What was important to you about it as the director of this project? To tell us a little bit about just how you came into it and what mattered to you.
Well, actually, the project really was initiated by students and students meeting with Chancellor Edwards. And to be honest, I was walking my dog, not this particular dog, who has decided at this particular moment that she needs to make her presence known. But I got a call, and I was asked whether or not I would chair the committee. And so I met with Chancellor Edwards and some other folks in the administration. And I have to say I had some misgivings. Because this was the end of 2015. And so they wanted a book by 2016 to celebrate the 250th anniversary. And actually, knowing how long publishing takes, I was a little skeptical that this could even be done. But the university promised me that I would have all the resources that I needed. And I held them to that promise, I want you to know. And with those promises, I proceeded. So we really have an amazing group of graduate students. The graduate students who were there in 2016 are no longer with us. I mean, no longer, they are now, most of them are assistant professors at other universities, but we had and still have an enormously talented group. Not all of them were experts in African American history or majoring in that, but they knew how to research, and we sent them to various archives. We had about 16 or so researchers, and each one took up a separate project, and they came back and they divided themselves into groups and decided, how to best write it. And by the summer, we had a manuscript, and my colleague Marisa Fuentes, as well as Camilla Townsend in the history department, helped me edit and write what needed to be written. And Rutgers University Press, of course, I mean, that's the key, because we needed a press. And Rutgers University Press came forth and published it by November. It's just record time, which is
wow.
Absolutely record time. But we all also we had just enormous help from people around the university, from the Sage Library at the Theological Seminary, the New Brunswick Theological Seminary, and also the library at Alexander, the special collections archivists. Everyone just came to me, many more people than I could actually use, in fact. What can I do? How can I help? And wherever I found a job, they did it without quarreling. It was an amazing coming together of people at the university.
Yeah, I can imagine. There are so many threads that I wanted to pick up on, even from what you just said. Maybe the first one I'm going to just ask you about a little bit. You mentioned archives in the plural, which I thought was intriguing, because you kind of assume it's Rutgers' story. Maybe there's one place you go for it. I wonder if you could just, not in great detail, but as much as you feel like sharing, but just when you say archives plural, where were you getting this information from that went into the production of these texts?
The Special Collections division in the Rutgers Library has a lot of records. On the other hand, we send people down to Trenton, to the state archives, to look. When people die, they register their wills. There are things that go into probate. So we had people going to Trenton we had folks going, at least one or two people who went to the National Archives down in Washington, D.C., particularly in terms of when we're trying to figure out how the land transferred, particularly how Rutgers became a land grant university. So it may sound strange, but part of the way that Rutgers got money to continue, and particularly after the Civil War, had to do with the sale of lands out west. So when after the Indian Wars, where America once again pushed Native Americans off the land out west, a lot of that land was sold in parcels. And so people who bought that land became investors, and a lot of those investors were people in New Jersey, and then they subsequently sold the land back to New Jersey. And it's a very complicated process that it's described in one of the chapters in the first volume.
So this is in a sense how the indigenous come into the story, is that the very land that Rutgers sits on,
Yes.
portions and parcels of it have to do with this linking with indigenous histories.
Yes, and they also come in because the land in 1776, I mean, Rutgers wasn't a land grant school, but what we did was the very first article, which is quite long, was written by Camilla Townsend, who is our Native American specialist. But the 25 students who did all of the research for that were undergraduates.
Wow.
And we had the undergraduates going to the special collections and also going to various archives. And what they did was to research the Lenape people and how they became dispossessed of their land very early by the Dutch settlers.
So recently, two professors at Rutgers, Annette Freitag in Mason from SEBS and Julia Ritter from Mason Gross, organized this kind of march, a community walk across Rutgers campuses. And there was a particular place that the march started that I had no idea had been an actual estate, had been a plantation, essentially. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of those discoveries that you made in terms of now linking more to Black and African-American history, about actual Rutgers spaces that were tied to the slave-owning economy.
You know, I personally am not familiar with, you know, the actual land. I do know, of course, that the Hardenbergs family owned the family of Sojourner Truth. And so we were able to tie Sojourner. This is one of the reasons for those of you who are listening or watching, that's how the apartment building came to be called. The new apartment dormitory complex on College Avenue campus came to be named after Sojourner Truth because her family was owned by the Hardenbergs. And that's a very, very, very tragic story because they did leave the family to pretty much fend for themselves and die alone. But nevertheless, we also tied an enslaved man named Will. One of our researchers found a receipt that was given for this, it was a slave named Will, for a receipt for his labor that was given to a doctor. I think he was a dentist in New Brunswick. They paid the Dutch founders paid this doctor for the labor for Will's labor, and Will worked on the building Old Queens. That's why it is now called Will's Way.
Yes.
So Will didn't get paid, but his owner got paid.
Yes. Yes.
And we imagine that there were many, many more African Americans who helped build the school's founding building.
Yeah. So from what you've told us so far, you went into this thinking it would be one volume, one volume produced very quickly, but nonetheless one volume. So what happened that led to what ultimately became a 3-volume story where you followed the ambition of taking it all the way up to the literal present? So what happened moving you into the second volume?
To be honest, and I'm hoping that Dick Edwards is watching actually, because I was under the impression when I agreed to do this that we would be doing 1 volume, but I think we were on stage during the presentation of the first volume when the chancellor says, and we're going to continue this in up to the present. And I don't know if I raised my eyebrows or what, but I was like, okay, really? But to be honest, I really do think it was important for us to do it because, if we just talk about the years of enslavement for African Americans and the antebellum period, we don't really get to know what that legacy is. Mm. So if the founding fathers and, if you have the Livingstons who are slave traders, in fact, and if you have the Frelinghuysen, Frelinghuysen was head of the American Colonization Society, which was a society that advocated the freedom of sending free Blacks back to Africa. So if you have people who found this university who really don't believe that African Americans are capable of learning or should be part of the university, that's not going to change just because there's now a civil war or so we actually get to see what that legacy is. And if you go to volume 2 and you realize that James Dixon Carr, who now has a library, the Kilmer Library named after him, you see that it's 126 years after the founding that the very first African American actually gets to graduate and to study here. I think it says an awful lot about why many people in New Brunswick do not feel connected to Rutgers University. This has not been a university that has connected, to African Americans. And if you figure that by World War II, 1945, only 25 known, and I say known because there may have been some Black people who were passing for white, but basically known African Americans graduated. It doesn't, when you see the roots of it, of the exclusion, then you're not surprised. You're not surprised. And we actually go into what the curriculum was. We go to what the curriculum was in the early years, and what people studied, and then at the turn of the century, what people were studying. So if you're studying text, and if you are researching and actually contributing to the intellectual foundation of this country that says, hey, Black people are, they can't learn, Black people are ignorant, Black people need to be separated. Of course, you're going to go through the next century believing that it's okay that there are no African Americans at this university.
How does this story of, I believe you call them, or it certainly saw it on the website, this forerunner generation that is a focus in this second volume, how do their stories, or some of their stories, do they refute what would have been those cultural assumptions about why Black people should not be going to university?
Oh my goodness, they, despite all of, despite the isolation that they felt, we know the most famous graduate, of course, and the person who leaves probably more records than anyone else is Paul Robeson. But we know that when he took the football field, because he was a football player, that when teams came, they called him the N-word. There were teams that wouldn't even play if he was on the field. And of course, it being such a rugged, let's call it, and a violent game, lots of times he was just beaten up, and it was, in the name of football. But here is somebody who was also on the debating team, who graduates Phi Beta Kappa. He graduates with honors. When Paul Robeson graduates, actually, he wins an elocution contest and a debating contest, and the newspapers all around New Jersey only report. They don't even report that he won. They report the second place winner, and they tell the story of the person who came in second, who was white. So these forerunners, the women at Douglas,
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Julia Baxter becomes the very first African American to graduate from Douglas, and she's let in by accident because they look at her black and white photo and they think she's white. And when she comes to the university, they try to get her to go to an HBCU, and her father absolutely refuses. But she's not allowed to live on campus. So they persevered, and many of them, if not most, graduate with honors. They have to be commuters. So it's not until in the 1940s that Black women can actually live on campus. And to be perfectly honest, there was this fear that, well, if Black women live on campus and they have male suitors, and they're going to have male friends, and the male friends come by, then they're going to be in the dormitory with our white women, etc. But if we also looked at the yearbooks, and there are all kinds of cartoons and pictures that are racist, just out and out racist. In one of the Douglas yearbooks, there's a woman in blackface, for example. In the 1920s on campus, I don't think it's on campus, but it certainly is in New Brunswick that you have the Rutgers Klan meets. So they're dealing with a lot of overt racism. They're dealing with a lot of isolation, but they nevertheless persevere. And I think it is the fact that they're still here in the 1970s, or at least late 1960s, that allows for another generation during the civil rights / Black Power movement, or what we call the Black freedom struggle, for this next generation to come. I mean, they opened the doors. That's the way I like it. They pushed open the doors, a little bit, and then that next generation came in after in the late 1960s and just, pushed it way wide open.
Well, I'm going to follow you, but I have one question before we move into the 60s. I know for historians, periodization matters. And I was curious why the specific, I want to make sure I get it right. I think it's 1865 to 1945. I have a feeling that there was things that I know that there were reasons there why you framed it that way. Why stop in 1945 for the second? What were you thinking there?
Well, I think that World War II and the end of World War II is a real watershed moment, because the United States has just fought a war to end fascism, to end racism. So it's a really good point to see, well, if African-American soldiers went to war to fight against racism, what's going on at home? So that nationwide, that is always this a really good watershed moment. But also it is in the post-1945 era that the United States moves into a period wherein you get many more social welfare programs, specifically dealing with education. Okay, so you have the Veterans Administration, the GI Bill. So the doors of most universities fly open, so that before World War II, a college education was really the province of the very rich or the almost rich. Most people may do with just a high school education. But with the GI Bill, all soldiers now are getting all kinds of loans and grants to go to college. And I mean, as as repayment for what they did during World War II, for really saving the world against fascism and democracy. So you begin to see how the university opens up. Unfortunately, it doesn't open up for African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not just at Rutgers, because we know that Livingston campus, the campus that really allowed so many GIs to get an education. I mean, Livingston expands exponentially after World War II. In fact, Livingston didn't exist before that, but because you had so many GIs coming back, and you also have the Veterans Administration. You have all kinds of FHA loans. And so people can actually not only buy a house, but they can go to school, and so many average people can become part of the middle class. And that's why 1945 is such an important date.
Yes. So the door opens primarily, not exclusively, but primarily white GIs are given an opportunity to kind of come into the university. Along with them, more students of color start to come in. What then starts to happen that shapes the way you focus the third volume? Because it seems that student activism is a very important organizing principle there.
Well, to be honest, in some ways, this also follows my own personal trajectory. I was on a campus in the very late 1960s and early 1970s, and we, as a result of the civil rights movement, I mean, the colleges and universities, even in the South, were beginning to desegregate. The very early 1960s, you saw Governor Wallace stand in the door of the University of Alabama saying, segregation now, segregation forever. The University of Mississippi, James Meredith integrated it in 1963. So these colleges are integrating. So what's going on in northern schools? The northern schools, they have been quote unquote integrated, but there are very few Black students on campus. So the very few Black students who are on campus say, hey, what about us? We want, we want company. We're tired of this isolation. And given the fact that the nation had its eye on the civil rights movement, this was the time. So there are a couple of books called the Civil Rights Movement on Campus, or the Black Revolution on Campus. And so it just made absolute sense. I know that when I was on campus, I went to Binghamton, Harper College at Binghamton University. We just said, we want more people that look like us. Mm-hmm. We want Black studies. Mm-hmm. So if they can do it at the University of Mississippi, why can't they do it here?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because the student activism frame seems to also allow you in the third volume to expand out geographically. There's a bit more of Newark and Camden that can enter into the story, and also to expand out to slightly different groups, most specifically Puerto Rican students, who of course also some inhabit the category of Black students, right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about how that activism frame allowed you to bring in some other of those stories, Camden, Newark, Puerto Rican activism.
Yeah, I will say, let me preface this by saying that Volume 3 was a challenge. It was far more challenging than the two previous volumes, because Rutgers, it had, in the 1950s, expanded geographically just tremendously. Mm-hmm. So that Camden, even though Camden becomes part of the Rutgers University system, I believe, in the 1950s sometime, and or at least in that 1945 to 1960s frame. And the same thing with Newark. I mean, they begin with law schools, and then there's a conglomeration in each case with putting small schools together and then them entering into the Rutgers system. So first of all, trying to figure that out for many of us was really challenging. And so much of what happens at Newark actually begins with students at the law school, even before Conklin Hall. So the chronology, trying to get that chronology straight was a challenge for us. But we wanted to make sure that we got New Brunswick, Camden, and Newark into this picture. Usually people focus on the Conklin Hall takeover. It is no doubt a signature moment, a signal moment. But Black students had also been organizing both at Camden as well as at New Brunswick, and they were coming together in Black student unions. All of this is happening and is growing out of things that are going on in the particular town or city that the school is located in. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, what's going on in Newark is an outgrowth, certainly, of the rebellions in Newark in 1967. And similarly, Camden, there are rebellions in Camden during this same period. New Brunswick has a slightly different situation, but nevertheless, there's activism in the New Brunswick area. So one of the things we certainly wanted to do was to make sure that everyone know that no one got left out, and that the Conklin Hall situation and the Conklin Hall takeover was not the only uprising and rebellion that we dealt with, and also that one of the things we also focus on was, who were the allies of Black people. So it's not just that Puerto Rican students joined. We had many white activists who were also part of, who also supported the rebellions and who also supported the shutdowns. In New Brunswick, there were walkouts, there were demonstrations in the dining halls. And so it wasn't just Puerto Rican students, but I think Puerto Rican students understood, could take it to another level with African Americans, because Puerto Rican students were also arguing it or wanting their own particular programs. They wanted Puerto Rican studies, they wanted Hispanic studies, they wanted the curriculum to expand. And not to mention that they wanted more Puerto Rican students on campus. So in that way, I mean, we also give a little of the history of Puerto Ricans in the state of New Jersey. So, yeah, that I hope that answers as much.
Yes. Yeah. And what's striking to me, especially in this I mean, it runs all the way through, but I'm hearing it in what you're saying about the third volume, is that there is the history of Rutgers is being told in in relationship to a particular set of things and a particular set of people, but the history of Rutgers as it evolves and develops over the course of 50 plus years is being told alongside or with this story. The two are connected, right? So the growth of Rutgers suddenly between 1945 and 1965 becomes a part of this story too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you can't, it's very, and particularly in the Newark case, as well as in the Camden case, you have changes in those cities. And the changes in the cities give rise to changes on the campus. So it's very symbiotic in that regard.
Yes. You purposefully titled the third volume with Black Lives Matter. Can you talk a little bit about that? What you and your team were thinking about in terms of bringing the story right up into being relevant for the present?
we were writing it. I mean, our graduate students gave us the articles, and myself and Maya Carey, who is also an assistant professor now at Binghamton, but one of the original researchers on volumes 1 and 2, as well as Marisa and I, we got these essays back around January 2020.
Mm.
And so we all know that by March, there was a shutdown. We also had, the Black Lives Matter movement has been around since 2013, but it really took on steam and with the death of George Floyd. And, when we hadn't even thought, it was at the very end, as these things usually happen, you kind of, okay, what have you got here? What do we have here? And so, when we polled each other and, it's like, we're talking about Black Lives Mattering at Rutgers.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And how, how students in particular led this movement. I mean, I think it's really interesting and important to note that in 2015, it was students who said, we want this history. And then again, so many young people and students in 2020 said, we still want this history, but that it was in the late 1960s, that it was the students. And remember, when we say students, we're talking about people who are 17 to 22 or 23, young adults and teenagers. And they just said, this matters to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they brought about the change.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I have a few other questions for Professor Gray White, but I also want to prime the audience a little bit, both our audiences online who can send me any questions you might want me to ask in the last 10, 15 minutes or so of our time here together by putting questions in the Q&A. So those are for the online audiences. And then for those of you who are in person, also, please, there should be people in the audience there who are available to collect questions. So start kind of thinking about what questions you might want to send for that I'd be happy to ask or answer. So just to kind of get you thinking, but to continue a little bit, Deborah, you mentioned something in the very, very beginning that I thought it might be useful for people to hear about. So you said something that soon after it was decided to begin this project, a committee was created. And I know it was called the Committee on Enslaved and Disenfranchised Populations in Rutgers History. And you were asked to chair that committee. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that committee and just what that was like, and how long did it stay throughout those, just how did that then lead to the volumes?
Right. I'm smiling because Rutgers seems to have a knack for naming things that are so long that you just can't even remember what it is. What was the name of that committee? It was a very large committee. Mm-hmm. And it had undergraduates as well as graduates. It had I think we actually did have a couple of members from the community. We had administrators. In fact, it was very large and unwieldy. And I met with them for most of the spring semester of 2016. But I realized that while it was really necessary for us to meet, and particularly just to catch the emotions that were there, what people wanted, but that in terms of actually doing the actual research and actually coming out with this book that we had, a matter of months to produce, that we needed experts. So I created a subcommittee, and this subcommittee was the committee that had the graduate student researchers, as well as professors, myself, Townsend, Professor Townsend and Professor Fuentes, as well as archivists at the university. and we worked very closely together, but at the same time meeting with members of the larger committee. What the members of the larger committee wanted, we have listed in the very first, in the conclusion to the very first volume. And as far as, where do we go from here? And one of the things was that we wanted to have for this to continue, this not to be the ending, but the beginning of something. We wanted scholarships. We asked for a diversity course. We asked for a variety of things, some of which have come to fruition for sure.
Can you mention, would you like to say a little bit about that? Which are the ones that, I mean, I'm sure, not that you have to remember all, but what has come to fruition from the committee, separate from the volumes, that you're pleased about?
Certainly. I'm really pleased that we have a website that is going to be ongoing, and it's an archival website so that people, as well as students in New Jersey and students around the country, can go to this website and look at some primary documents, the primary documents that we use. Some of them we have opened up the library in this regard, and asking and receiving papers from some of our alumni that will grow this history and this treasure trove of documents, primary documents about Blacks here at Rutgers. So, and that is going to be a permanent part of the library, and the archive will be continually updated. So I'm really, really pleased about that. I'm pleased about the plaques, although I understand that there has been some pushback. I do know that there's been some pushback by some New Jersey families who are a little upset at the way that their families are being depicted, and these plaques. But I do think it's important that that we put a plaque in front of Hardenbergh Hall for however long Hardenbergh Hall exists, that tells us about the history of the Hardenbergs. So the plaques have gone around campus. The naming, I'm very pleased that we have named the Sojourner Truth Apartments, and naming continues to go on. In essence, one of the things I think we have done with this is to introduce a whole population that Rutgers totally forgot about, and people who ought to be noted in Rutgers history. So the James Dixon car. And so that I think that's very important. I think we were interested in getting a center. I don't know if that was one of the things that we listed, but there is now the new institute that you had, and we have institutes on Camden and New Brunswick and Newark campuses. Diversity course and a diversity requirement was something that the larger committee talked about and wanted, and I don't think that has been instituted yet. So we will have to light a fire under our faculty and see if that can be passed.
Yes, there's one of the things that was on your list is one of the last things that I wanted to ask you about before turning to see if I have some questions from the audience, and it's about monuments. I was noticing as you were talking that you would, from the very beginning, that you would link aspects of different parts of the story to different kinds of places, sites, walkways on campus, and then you just did this just now, even in talking about the plaques. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but just thinking about the committee's work, I believe that the Board of Governors voted this week to remove Joseph Bradley's name from a Newark campus building. So both the removal of names and the addition of names, right? I just wondered if you wanted to just say a little bit as a historian about kind of monuments and plaques, and what is happening right now in terms of what we do with this history, how we manifest it.
Well, I also think isn't it the case that the wall, the monument or the statue of Walt Whitman down at Camden was moved from in front of the campus building, the campus student center. I think that this has to be done on a case. This is my very personal opinion.
Mhm.
That this has to be done on a case-by-case basis, and that it should come from the student body. That the initiative should come from the students. If students want to shape the environment in which they live, I think that's really important. If people are uncomfortable with somebody like Walt Whitman being in front of the student campus building, then they should gather. This particular Supreme Court justice who voted, his decision was such that it overturned the Civil Rights Act of in 1883. He called unconstitutional the Civil Rights Act that was part of Reconstruction. So in essence, that put a real end to Reconstruction and made the Black codes and Jim Crow laws, proliferate across the country. I don't think that we should erase this history, because if you erase it, then you have a way of forgetting. And I think Americans are really good at forgetting history. So I think we have to be very careful. I don't think that there should be monuments to Confederates because they were traitors. But in other cases, I think we do it on a case-by-case basis. I also believe, this is my personal opinion, that if I've got to put energy, emotional energy, physical energy, if I've got to put political energy into something to make life better on campus, I want reparations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would, if I've got to deal with the state legislature, I want scholarships.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can spend an awful lot of time moving names around, et cetera, and yet not really changing the environment or changing the lives of particularly African Americans and Puerto Ricans in this state.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I like to put my energy. Let's shout out the $45 million initiative that President Holloway announced recently to bring in more Black faculty. That's where I want to see that's the limited energy that I have left. I really want to see those things happen.
So after being told that, it was going to be one volume in pretty much a year, okay, it expanded, but I just talk about energy. I just want to say, as an academic, I started to produce 3 volumes covering all of this history in 6 years is as much as a testament to the initiative and the original momentum provided by the students who call for this, but it is also a testament to your leadership in being able to move that along, to actualize that so fast and so powerfully over the course of these last 6 years. So I do want to give you props on that. I think you have energy in space.
Yeah, it's right? All gone now. I've used it up.
You used it up. Just for the audience to also know, very much the Scarlet and Black Project does continue through the Institute. It is a centerpiece of the New Brunswick branch specifically, which is now being led by Dr. Erica Dunbar, who is also a historian, one of Dr. Gray White's colleagues in history. But in general, the Scarlet and Black Project is an Institute signature project, and one of its ambitions also, Deborah mentioned a couple in terms of the archive, developing the archive and developing the digital archive. But a third initiative actually is they have ambitions that the team, there is still a team, obviously, of new scholars and they have ambitions to really play a role in contributing to the introduction and the development expansion of the teaching of African American history in New Jersey high schools, in the New Jersey high school system at large. That's a kind of new ambition of the project that is related to just the experience of having created such a historically, archivally thick and rich project here to contribute to what we know about Rutgers. So I wanted to mention that. And I think I'm gonna, as we move here towards the end, slide things back over. Thank Deborah for engaging in this conversation with me, and slide things back over to Lavinia, who may have a question herself. And so I'll give it to you.
Have to unmute. I do. I actually have a question for both of you. Thank you, first of all, and I'll do my formal thank yous in a moment. But recognizing the role of student voices to bring about change to our university, albeit not as quickly as any of us want it to be. But looking at the history of the influence there, and also looking at this moment in time that we are in, and the fact that our environment has been seeded by these 3 volumes is incredible. But also with the arrival of Jonathan Holloway as our first African-American president. I know I speak for the foundation when I say, in order for us to affect change, to engage alumni of color, employees of colors, and others, we want to invite our allies in. And I know that there are a lot of alumni who have not felt heard over the years. And I wonder if the 2 of you could speak about, within the context of what you're doing, and maybe encourage them to bring their stories forward and their experiences forward, and also to help us chart the future along with our students.
I'm going to cite, so the colleague I mentioned before, Dr. Dunbar, Erica Dunbar, who is the director of the New Brunswick branch of the Institute, often says we have to tell the story of America differently. We have to tell the full story, or tell multiple stories of America, right? The volumes certainly represent that, right? I think what I would kind of encourage and invite a Rutgers alum, period, across the board, to join us in telling multiple news stories about your Rutgers experience, about what it means to be in this country, to be an American, or to be just here in this country with Americans at this moment in history, right? So that, and I think that's very much what we are interested in thinking about the study of global racial justice. It's really about kind of how do we need to tell our stories with a recognition that multiple kinds of people exist in the same institutions, in the same spaces, in the same projects. How can we tell stories in which it's not just about inclusion, it's also about seeing each other and understanding, oh, maybe you do live differently than I do. What would it mean for me to try to understand that? So to the degree that I'm sure our alumni population is incredibly diverse, because Rutgers is, I would love for that diversity, for everyone to feel like they could bring that to the Institute and to Rutgers.
I am officially a senior fellow at this institute, and one of the projects that I want to undertake is to maintain contact with alumni. Those that I have met, at least over the summer, I keep, I haven't gotten cards made up, but to keep telling them, well, I'm going to be at the institute, so you know, I can be your contact person. So, and I do think, I agree. I do know specifically that many African-American alumni feel like they have been really, really ignored. And I'm thinking that that is something that I can contribute. So the problem, of course, is COVID. You know, it's so difficult right now for everything to come together in a way that I'm used to doing things a particular way. So having to do everything on Zoom, but we're going to get it together, and there will be outreach to alumni for sure.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. You're incredible scholars, and the work that you've done on behalf of our university is just amazing. I am going to share my screen again to put up the Scarlet and Black website. Did that work? I hope. Great. So I want people to see that as a resource and to tap into that. And if there are people who are watching who are interested in learning a little from another angle about Dr. Anna Branch and her equity office at the university, as well as the efforts on behalf that the foundation is doing on these issues, we're going to be speaking on that in another session at 3 o'clock. But thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Deborah. You're both incredible assets to the university and important voices for our alumni body to hear from. So thank you so much for your time today.
Our pleasure.
Thanks.
And
Thank
thank you for everyone who
So long.
participated.